Let's talk about profit through selling vintage clothing. Watch this video if you want to learn how to make the most for what you spend. What's going on, everybody? Spencer Line here again as per. For those that don't know, in 2012 I started my very own vintage and secondhand clothing company called Gully Garms. Last year, sadly, I had to close it due to COVID, Brexit, employment issues and loads of other technicalities. If you want to know more about that, there's a video actually on the YouTube. And now I'm here 2024 on YouTube wanting to give value back on what I've learned on this industry since 2012. And today I wanted to talk about how to maximize profits selling vintage. I know that vintage is one part of the secondhand economy and the sustainable fashion element, but I'm sure a lot of you are selling just vintage. And I want to look at some of the options and some of the ways of approach with how we can actually maximize its profitability. So when we think about maximizing profit selling vintage, it's the same way of maximizing any profit. All we need to look at is how do we spend the least amount of money and make the most out of it. So we've got to look at two different brackets of this, what we spend and what we receive. Now, when an item sells, individual items like vintage clothing, we only receive that payment once as we have one of one products. And it is the same for the outgoing costs, however, it's not one cost that goes out. Typically, if you're a reseller and specifically of vintage, I would say that you use third-party websites, you may be still working from home. Also, another point to add, I'm going to be looking at the gross profit of this. So we're not going to be assuming that you have a premises and we're going to factor in gas and electricity. We're just going to look at the gross costs of buying and selling vintage and the profitability to maximize it. What you receive from selling a vintage item is the cost that you have sold that product for. That is all you receive from it. But before the journey starts of selling it, you have to have sourced the clothing. The first outgoing cost is the item itself. How much did that product actually cost you to buy? Was you charged VAT? Did you have to use petrol to go and travel to go and pick it up? Maybe you went on a bus to different charity shops and found it. These are really important figures to know as well. Say for example, you went to a charity shop, cost you £5 on a bus and you bought 5 items, £1 per item in travel fee. Obviously not that complex, but that is the system that we're looking at. So you've got the sourcing of the item itself, and now we've got to look at the distribution of it. So when we think of the distribution, we think of where you're marketing your product or where you're selling it. Are you selling it at car boots and markets, Depop, third-party platforms, or is it your own Shopify? Either way, along one of those journeys, there's an ultimate cost that comes across it. So let's just home in and assume that the average person watching this is selling on a third-party platform like Depop, eBay, Etsy, or Vinted. Now, one thing to note about the cost of insertion fees for most of the platforms is that you only pay this amount when you've actually sold the product. So a lot of the fees and figures are worked out after that item is actually sold. For example, you wouldn't have to worry about the cost of the shipping if you hadn't actually shipped the item because it hadn't sold, but once it has sold, then that cost is factored in. Did you lose, did you make, or was it completely even on the shipping? So let's actually take this vintage Alessi t-shirt that I'm wearing right now as the example. Let's say, for example, there's a supplier, he sold this t-shirt to me for £3. I had to get there to go and get it alongside other clothing. Let's just say that there's a 50p cost for the fuel and the travel and all the expenses of actually picking this up. So this t-shirt is now £3.50. I decided I want to sell this on Depop and I want to put it up for £15. Try and get a quick sale, get a nice turnover. I'm still looking at about a 4 times return on that investment as well. So £15, I sell it for, somebody buys it on Depop. So the £15 minus the insertion fee, which is about 10%, so £1.50. Now, if you've used a boosted listing, so the sponsored way of promoting your product, you'll pay an extra 8% insertion fee also. So let's just accrue that to 20% and then cut it off a little bit at the end. So that'd be £3 off the £15, which would leave me at 12, then minus another £3.50 for the item, which would leave it at £8.50 profit. So when we just zoom back out and we come to the point about maximizing the profits through vintage, that one example would show you how much it would cost to buy and how much you would actually receive. There are other points you have to think of, which is how have you taken the photo, how have you uploaded it, where have you uploaded it, but the internet falls under the same bracket as like the gas and electricity. They're figures you work out to get the net cost of what you will receive in profits versus the gross of when you just take away what it's cost you versus what you've received. Now, this makes things quite challenging to work it out as a rule of thumb. Third-party platforms all operate in completely different ways. So as we all know, Vinted don't charge you any postage and their system seems to work in a little bit of a different way. Depop will charge you 10% and then charge you 8% if you boost your listing, so sponsor it. Etsy and eBay are the two platforms that will actually charge you insertion fees. I believe that Etsy's is 20 cents per listing and eBay's can fluctuate dependent on what specs you use. For example, if it's a buy it now or an auction, whether you upload more picture products, but that can be a fluctuated cost. Now, one thing I would say about insertion fees with third-party platforms is that you pay that regardless of if the product sells. So say, for example, I listed this on Etsy and I was like, yeah, I can sell it for 25 on there. I'm paying the 20 cents regardless. So if it sells on Depop, I've still had to pay 20 cents for this and that will be taken off the profit. Now, again, it's really hard to sort of condense what we're looking at, but all we want to do is we want to see the cheapest way to buy something and the most money we can actually make from it. Here's a couple scenarios that I want to leave you with with so that you can have a little bit of a think of and maybe see if this is where you are in line with what you're doing. One way to maximize the profit selling vintage is to go for lower grades with a higher return on investment and sell through third-party platforms. Buying lower grade sweatshirts, say vintage grade B sweatshirts at £5 per item versus potentially £12 to £20 per item of grade A vintage sweatshirts will allow you to make more profit selling lower grades at more affordable prices. Firstly, if you're in the UK, you're definitely appealing to a lot more people who are in situations where they don't have as much money as the people buying Stussy and Stone Island. That's also a tangent point because people who buy Stussy and Stone Island, they buy those brands for a set of different reasons. Maybe it's heritage, culture, purpose in a different capacity. Buying a slightly lower grade or a cheaper alternative from a supplier of vintage to then sell on third-party platforms allows you to maximize the profit. Selling it on a third-party platform does mean that you lose the insertion fee. Grade B sweats and vintage just means that you don't have a website to manage. It goes straight up on the platforms and you can get it shot off nice and quick. I know I talk about low grade versus high grade a lot of the time, and the reason why I focus on the low grade is because the profits can be maximized through cheaper vintage. If this was £7 at wholesale price, grade A, versus £4 at grade B wholesale price, I would still make more profit buying it at grade B and selling it at a grade B price versus buying it grade A and selling it grade A. I want to just home in on this point so we can centralize to an actual conclusion. When we look at maximizing the profits through vintage, we have to consider the ways that we sell the product, what platforms we are working on, what our actual setup is. Most importantly, where we're getting that stock from in order to get the best return on investment. One of the main reasons why I think that going for lower grade, say grade B, average or middle ground price vintage that's still vintage, there's less people trying to grab it at wholesale price because they're all going for the grade A, the high-end designer sorted after vintage. There's more of a market for people who still want stuff at affordable prices, and the profitability is a lot higher on lower valued stock. Because as a rule of thumb, a supplier is going to think grade B to A, there's such a big jump, but on the return, when you actually sell it, there's not that much of a decline in the price. If this was grade A vintage condition, I might sell it at £20 to £22, but at grade B, I'm still going to be selling it between 14 and 15. So the price of what it cost me is half, but the actual price I've sold it for is a quarter less. Does that make sense? What I want you to take from this is that when we think about the profitability through selling and buying vintage, we just have to look at the simplest way of breaking it down. You've got one side, which is your income from this and selling it. So you've got the product cost just there, and then on the other side, the cost of the stock, the insertion fees, where you're selling it and how you actually sourced it, and that cost is there. We're going to leave it in the two-dimensional space and not think about when you have internet, when you've got VAT, tax and insurance that comes in to sort of create a bit more of a complexity with what that profit would mean. But on a gross basis, without taking all that other stuff into consideration, that is what I'm going to leave you with. Now guys, please let me know if there's something that you want me to discuss a little bit further, break down topics in a little bit more depth. I will be soon bringing some podcast style content here, but firstly, it will be going on my Patreon. If you do want to join the community of like-minded resellers, it's £4.50 a month for 3 videos a month currently. Now that price for the service isn't going to change, and there will hopefully be new styles of content added, but the aim of the game on there is to teach people and teach like-minded people like yourself, hopefully, how to actually successfully build a brand online. I'll still be here doing videos every single day on YouTube until I physically can't make them anymore, but guess what? I'm a hard worker, so I will make sure that I get it done. Now, as always, guys, stay safe, stay sustainable, stay doing you, trust the process, and don't watch what anybody else is doing. Just stay focused on what it is you're doing. You're in your lane. Everyone's in their own lane. Just focus on where you're going. We're not going that way, we're going that way. So yeah, big up.